Thank you so much, Josh, for the introduction and the invitation and the opportunity to actually share this new work with you guys. What I want to present today is really something really fresh and new. And Chernobyl work, or everything that I call it, like the Chernobyl research, began probably like about 6 years ago. However, this kind of work is extremely slow because of the specifics of this research, that you cannot make long trips in the zone, and it takes a lot of time to process. And then because I actually live in Vancouver, so you can imagine that these trips cannot be very often. So it started 6 years ago, and it will probably last for quite a while. And only now I am actually starting something as a certain research stream, along with other topics that I've been dealing in my research before. So what I'm presenting today is basically a kind of a theoretical conceptualization of my forthcoming project. So it's like theory text. It doesn't include many examples. It doesn't include everything behind the scene, ethnography, references, other stuff. And I would be very happy to expand or talk more about those things in maybe Q&A. But now I would like to see, and maybe with your help, figure out how would this conceptual, hardcore theoretical framing of this potential maybe book project looks like. So it also will come out as an essay soon. But so far it's just like this attempt to conceptualize what I want to do in this forthcoming project. So, and it has to do, the title is not clear to me at this point, but it will have to do with the concept of territory and biological citizenship. And I will talk more about this quite interesting concept that I borrowed from another scholar, but changed and quite developed in a very different direction in my work. So I'm going to share my slides with you. So you should be able to see them now, do you? Okay, perfect. So biological citizenship, the case of the Chernobyl zone. Most often, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, is called by one of the two terms that are usually used interchangeably, accident or catastrophe. Among the two, the term catastrophe is broader, and it suggests the devastating and damaging outcome of the event. Neither of the terms, however, implies that the tragic outcome is entirely unforeseeable. Catastrophe originates from the Greek word, which means the end, overthrow, death. The term came from drama, where it stood for a fatal consequence of adverse events that had happened earlier. Such fatality for the Greeks always involved a clear, deadly logic and an inevitable trajectory of deployment, the understanding of which, unfortunately, always comes too late. So if the catastrophe comes unexpected, it is only due to the limitation of knowledge or the lack of information. Philosopher Ian Hacking reminds us that the conception of accident or chance changed in the 19th century due to the emergence of a new kind of objective knowledge that came into being as a product of new technologies for gaining information about natural and social processes that led to the erosion of determinism through the development of mathematical statistics, probability theory, and the laws of random phenomena. Chance, he writes, became tamed in the sense that it became the very stuff of the fundamental process of nature and society. Since chance was no longer accidental and could be captured by a mathematical formula or calculation, its status changed from non-systemic to systemic. It became a predictable logical part of complex events, even if hiding in plain sight. This new epistemology of chance that later developed via cybernetics and systems theory was foundational for the cultural theorist Paul Virilian's description of the Chernobyl disaster as the original accident. Virilian argued that without an accident, we remain unaware of how technology functions. He elaborated by citing French writer Paul Valéry, who observed that the tool is tending to vanish from consciousness. We commonly say that its function has become automatic, so consciousness only survives now as awareness of accidents, end quote. This reading suggests that the accident functions like psychoanalytic afterwardness that initiates a belated understanding or retroactive attribution of meaning to technology. Although it is created beforehand, it can only qualify as an invention after the accident exposes the whole range of its creative and destructive capacities. Virilian writes, the accident reveals the substance. In other words, accidents are teleological in how they expose the essence of technical objects through the purpose they serve, rather than the cause by which they come to be. Take a shipwreck, Virilian explains. Without it, the invention of a ship is incomplete. The shipwreck consistently is the futurist invention of the ship, and the air crash, the invention of the supersonic airliner, just like the Chernobyl meltdown is the invention of the nuclear power station. By introducing the notion of risk society immediately after the explosion of the Chernobyl reactor, sociologist Ulrich Beck described a novel sense of emergency characterizing all life processes after Chernobyl in a similar way. As a culmination of technological modernity. Such awareness also implies a state of awaiting when the subject is caught by the inverted temporality of the future accidents determining the past. Living in a risk society, according to Beck, means witnessing a global increase in the number of man-made disasters accidents, including technogenic catastrophes that leave irreversible imprint on the large areas, turning them into ghostly exclusion zones, the accidental territories in the Virilian sense of the word. In his book, The Birth of Territory, political theorist Stuart Eldon explores the emergence of the concept of territory in Western political thought as a distinctive mode of social spatial organization by distinguishing the notions of territory and territoriality. Territoriality is understood through two conflicting traditions. The first biological, the second social. The latter considers the rapid changes of human and social organization. The former studies the fundamental biological drives and the forms of animal association, crucial for understanding of territory. But territory, Eldon notes, is more complex because territory is conceptually prior to territoriality, even if existentially second. He suggests that even if the meaning of territoriality has today a rather more active connotation, it is a concept of territory that serves as a condition of possibility that mobilizes the processes associated with territoriality, understood as the condition of status of territory rather than a mode of operating towards that territory. Territory and territoriality are not bound by mutual or other causality. Instead, the dynamics of their relation reveal how the persistent territorialization is disturbed by unmappable territoriality. Territoriality encompasses both deterritorialization, or the process of losing the territory's organization and context, and reterritorialization, or the territory's re-establishing and resetting, as the two demonstrate a pulsating relation of the push-pull, almost dialectical balance. That all comes from Stuart Eldon. Territoriality, I suggest, is that third term without which this old puzzle of the map territory relation will remain indeed an unresolvable paradox. It demonstrates an impossibility of mapping a territory that is always unequal to itself, being either smaller or larger than what is mapped. It is in this theoretical setting I locate the discussion about the territory of the Chernobyl zone and its border that bounds several larger contaminated areas, along with a variety of smaller spots marked by radioactive pollution into one single entity. The territory of the Chernobyl zone of exclusion is a result of a systemic accident. My ethnographic project that explores the technological, political, and cultural circumstances of delineating the zone's border reveals that this border is anything but not a container, even though it was established by this kind of powerful agencies, such as the Soviet armed forces back in 1986, right after the accident. And then since 2011, it was administered by the State Agency of Ukraine on the Exclusion Zone Management, an agency within the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, and is currently guarded and policed by special units of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. This territory is continually deterritorialized and re-territorialized by the agents and processes of territoriality that not only destabilize and transgress the territory's porous borderline, but also disseminate and process its content contamination. The diverse continuity of various human and non-human life forms, the biotic population of the Chernobyl zone who act as the agents of territoriality are, however, the subjects of territory. To be in the territory is to be the subject of sovereignty, Eldon writes. You are subject to sovereignty while you are in territory and not beyond. And territory is the space within which sovereignty is exercised. It is the spatial extent of sovereignty, end quote. The dual position of the agent of territoriality, who simultaneously is the subject of territory, cannot be changed upon a departure from the contaminated areas. The body of the agent of territoriality is an extension of territory. No matter how far the subject drifts from the epicenter of the non-accidental catastrophe, the body is marked by a radioactive trace of the state's technopolitics, a material inscription of the state on the body of the subject to sovereignty. Here, the body is occupied or subsumed by the state, and it serves as a realm for the state's territorial expansion on a micro level of the flesh, biopolitically governing it towards uncertain futures. In Manual for Survival, an environmental history of the Chernobyl disaster, historian of science Kate Brown draws attention to how human and non-human bodies, as well as various life forms, were exploited as part of the complex assemblage of heterogenic entities that cycled and filtered radioactive substances days after the explosion. And she writes, "The newsreels of the May holiday did not record the actions of 2.5 million lungs, inhaling and exhaling, working like a giant organic filter. Half of the radioactive substances Kievans inhaled, their bodies retained." Understanding the impact of ionizing radiation on health and environment, both in the cases of short-term and long-term exposures, requires a study of many generations. Today, the mounting evidence presented by radiologists who research the complex interplay between exposure, organism physiology, and phenotypic response over extended timescales through the lens of epigenetics already demonstrates that the changes caused by the impact of radiation in gene activity and transcript architecture, including splicing variation, that cannot be explained solely by changes in DNA sequence, are heritable over generations. The difficulty of studying such cases is that they could be observed not in the generations that undergone the short or long-term radiation exposure, but in the performance of genes of future generations, and also because depending on the specifics of different cases, these effects could be multi-generational or transgenerational. Even though the logic of its occurrences is still unclear, the fact that the biopolitical epigenetic inscription occurs on citizens' bodies is not only archived in them, but is transmittable to other generations. Turning the bodies of the subjects of territory into such archive is an ultimate expression of territorial sovereignty written into the subjects on the level of the flesh. Producing understanding of the record of the bodies done by radioactive dispositions requires time. It is significantly slower than the upfolding performance of the written. The performance is a material trace of and a material witness to the history of political violence. Such material witness, Susan Shupley writes, opens a possibility for an exploration of the evidential role of matter as registering external events, as well as exposing the practices and procedures that enable such matter to bear witness. It's from her book, recent book, The Material Witness. Soon after the Chernobyl catastrophe, medical anthropologist Adriana Petryna studied the state's public health and welfare infrastructure, where increasingly poor citizens, former and current Chernobyl plant workers, and populations resettled from the contaminated zones mobilize around their claims of radiation-induced injuries. She termed such social practice and political mobilization that has emerged in Ukraine in early 90s, biological citizenship. For Petryna, the concept of biological citizenship is particularly viable in how it lends itself to reconceptualization with the consideration I jumped the lines. For Petryna, the concept of biological citizenship sheds the light on a fundamental practice of polity building in post-socialism. Today, the notion of biological citizenship is particularly viable in how it lends itself to reconceptualization with the consideration of this context that I just outlined. My take on it, however, is rather pessimistic. If Petryna's version of the notion captures the processes of citizens' mobilization around claiming rights to healthcare, I use this term to mark their loss due to the subsumption of citizens' bodies by the state. Citizenship is always a result of political-economic arrangements, power relations, and technopolitics preserved and reenacted by durable imperial infrastructures. One of such infrastructural microelements escaped the nuclear reactor in micro quantities and disseminated as a radioactive fallout, producing the contaminated territory and its extension, biological citizens. The subjects of territory, together with their next generations and the generations of other life forms exposed to radiation, they became the carriers of the infrastructural inscription of the state beyond the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapse in 1991 into the future. The state survives by its traces. This is it.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. There we go. Okay, that was incredible. I really enjoyed that paper. And I've got a few questions. I'll see if anybody in the audience would like to begin. Anne?
Hey there. So yeah, thank you so much for those reflections. It's interesting, right? Like in STS, we run across this literature in a kind of historical way, right? We could think a lot about how nuclear histories and accidents have really formed the field. But you're sort of bringing us back to, I think, like some kind of under-resolved questions in both how we think about risk societies, but also, you know, the kind of longer Foucauldian legacy of biopolitics and, you know, like the whole kind of like, for me, like critical theory apparatus of the subject. So I'm kind of curious where you see this intervention sort of pushing those literatures, right? Because there's a way in which we've inherited this language about like subjects and states and the kind of Foucauldian passive voice, right? Which sometimes pops up in your paper, right? About how like citizens are inscribed through their bodies by the state, but it's like a state that doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm sort of wondering like, how do you see this language as like sort of under strain in this sort of contemporary conjuncture? Is the goal of the paper to sort of critique a state which is not but might again be? Yeah, how do we kind of understand power if we are still using these languages that presume that states are singular, coherent, and kind of timeless entities when they have indeed eroded over the decades. That's a lot of messy questions, but I'm curious if they.
Yeah, thanks so much for this, because it reminded me, I sort of almost never think about this, but this project, when it began, when I began thinking about this project quite a long time ago, it actually, one of the kind of key ideas was precisely that, about the continuity of a state that is no longer existing. And I think that's where precisely we can think about certain state powers, right? So we constantly associate them and speak about them as related to certain particular current state power, et cetera, but here, suddenly you could see with this certain legacy, right? So the legacy of the zombie state. And if you think about the Chernobyl zone in general, which is of course not just in Ukraine, right? So part of it is in Belarus and in Russia. So in a certain way, so this territory still unites those three countries that wanted to separate, but are forced to still leave that Soviet Union in a certain way. And with this kind of whole situation was so kind of interesting to me. I mean, here, of course, it's partly metaphorical, but still quite an interesting situation to actually like explore on different levels. But then speaking non-metaphorically, but quite politically and literally, about certain Soviet technopolitics, right? Because it's particularly because of certain Soviet technopolitics that this accident happened, right? So, and by this, I mean certain decisions, certain competitions, certain fails, and the attitude to human life, right? So with all of it was there. So in a certain way, with this inscription is the inscription of this Soviet state specifically. And that is a kind of a story there as well that was preserved here only by one line. But again, I plan to think about what this particular union of the three countries and what it means, what this territorial union by means of contamination.
Yeah, the idea of the zombie state is such a really evocative one too. Like I hope it encouraged that you'll tease that
I really
out.
think that it even tells us something about the power of existing states, right? So when we look at the state that is non-existent anymore, but still having its traces, I hope that it also teaches us something about the state's power that is actual now. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I mean, it seems to me that you talk about state, but you also talk about an exercise of sovereignty. And I mean, I'm a little bit confused about the Bruce Eldon and the tripartite thing that you mentioned. So I'm really curious to just know more about that. But what I'm thinking about is, you know, somebody that you don't mention, probably for different reasons, but you don't talk about Agamben. And when I think about questions of sovereignty, and you also evoke the witness, I'm mindful of, you know, his archetype for thinking about sovereignty, which was Auschwitz. And so, I mean, the way that you responded to Anne was, you know, the Chernobyl example is about the specificity of this place and about the exercise of state power in a post-Soviet circumstance. But then I wonder if there's something more general that we can say about it, which I think you're also wanting to do. And is it different or similar to previous models that we've explored. For example, the camp.
Yeah, Agamben is still something that I will come back with this project, specifically what you mentioned, Josh. Yeah, it's very important. Not ready. I'm not ready to talk about this at this moment, but in terms of Stuart Eldon and his idea of sovereignty, he is associating this, particularly with all this work that I've done. I know it's been like a very theoretical thing. I don't know if it was easy to follow, probably not so much, but it's quite an interesting distinction that he offers there between territory and territoriality. And it is territory is that which is associated with sovereignty. When I started thinking about this project, and again, with like this very idea of contamination, at some point, somehow, I can't even fully explain this now, but maybe it comes through here and there, how would suddenly with this idea of contamination reminded me something or told me something about citizenship as even some form of belonging, as even some form of relation, and etc., etc. So, and as even contamination in this particular case almost became an expression of some materiality of something like citizenship, sovereignty, and relation to certain territory. So, Eldon, of course, doesn't write about any kind of this sort of territories, but this sort of contaminated territories that became a kind of bordered out and walled out places in between some kind of states and non-states and strange entities, etc., etc. They, in a certain way, it seems to me, allows us to make certain parallels or distinctions and etc. to how states work and how we identify, build or describe certain relations of belonging to these territories.
Well, I mean, I know Mike has a question here, but just quickly, I mean, I really appreciate the way that you framed the concept of citizenship, because I think all too frequently, okay, I don't mean to be overly critical of Jennifer Gabriz, but, you know, the idea of the citizen censor seemed to me to evoke this sort of general agency or the power of transformative protest or something like this. Without evoking the histories of that term, which actually are lodged in imperialism and colonialism in a specific
Absolutely.
European. And so you sort of described, I mean, you mentioned, I forgot her last name, but Adriana's concept of biological.
Petryna.
Yeah, pardon me, yeah. But you sort of push back against her idea and suggest that, I think you said it was a loss. You know, it's like about the implication of bodies in an exercise of sovereignty. So my question then would be, what then do you do with the idea of witnessing? Like, what does witness do politically in terms of the questions that you're asking? But I don't know, maybe I can come back to that.
Yeah, what sort of witnessing are you thinking of? What, like, even if we think about Chernobyl,
well, I mean, it's okay. You now I'm anticipating too many questions that I already want to ask you later. But it's, you know, you were talking about doing some ethnography.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you know what? I think I can actually answer that by bringing Susan Shupley again, because that form of witnessing, not just witnessing as we usually speak about it, but this particularly very interesting work that she did on material witness. And she writes also on Chernobyl. It's one of those projects that she thinks, right? So that's where this witnessing, it's not by the subject, but by the matter itself. So the inscription is the revelation, is the witness, right? So the inscription of the state technopolitics, the trace, is the witness. In a certain way, I also like it because it, I mean, when I speak about this subject, I mean it very much in kind of almost Lacanian psychoanalytic sense, right? So not the agent, but in fact, someone who is submerged in a certain way, right? So exploited in a certain way, unconscious about something, right? So, and here is also quite the case because radiation, especially when we speak about all this slow exposures and low doses, right? So it's something that you completely cannot notice. And, but the processes go on. So what I am hoping to engage more with this idea of the material witnessing here. Yeah.
So interesting. Mike?
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to everybody for coming tonight, and thanks to Josh for organizing as always, particularly when it was difficult as it was tonight. One thing I kind of wanted to bring together in my question, the beginning of your talk with the end of your talk, because I was really inspired by your comment that the state survives by its traces. Because usually, you know, I was like, oh, survives by it. Like usually I think of traces as like, that's the record of something, you know, the traces in the geological record of this or that, or you know, traces of things aren't usually something I think of as a means for survival. Which is really neat. And I was wondering if you could maybe tie that in with your comment at the beginning that you do have some examples that you might be able to share, and that you were happy to expand on this. Can you give us a kind of example from Chernobyl and its territory and territoriality that might fit with the idea of this surviving by traces, in addition to things like traces in lungs and that kind of thing?
Yeah, in addition to this material traces that we already talked a little bit. So for this project, I also think about infrastructures, right? So as those material remains, for example, by which states survive, right? So also speaking of the Soviet Union, which is inexistent, but there are certain infrastructures that are still placed and working and arrange certain power and work relations and whatnot, right? So, and even certain imperial relations support those relations, etc., after the collapse of the state. So it's also very interesting to think in terms of like different knowledge infrastructure and that were related to Chernobyl, and in terms of how exactly certain research was done, for example, in and around Chernobyl, before the accident and after the accident, and who acquired all the results, right? So, and when you trace all those things, certain knowledge infrastructures, right? So certain industrial infrastructures, all these things are particular traces of the state that is not existent, but still acting out.
That's really great. Thank you.
Further questions for Svitlana? I'm really curious about this ethnographic aspect to your work and how that might factor, because I mean, I would guess that if you were to speak with folks who were directly connected to that event, or who have been implicated, you know, through their, you know, through being ill, or have, you know, relatives or something that are close to that region, if you described the distinction between catastrophe and accident, they might be angry or something, But whereas, of course, it makes sense in terms of the framing and the theory that you're putting forward. So I guess I'm asking a sort of methodological question, but also just like, how does that look for you in terms of what you want to do with this work?
So there are different themes where I do some ethnographic work with. One concerns the border. I do not discuss much catastrophe or accident, right? So I don't need to persuade these people that was a catastrophe, right? So like, it was not a catastrophe, obviously. But what's interesting to me, and I already done some ethnographic work over these years, and what I'm trying to learn more is about what were policies, politics, and some other aspects, cultural, political, economic, etc., about establishing of the border. That's where it's incredibly interesting to actually talk to people who, because, all people are removed from the Chernobyl zone now, right? But there are still many people who work in Chernobyl itself. Because there are a couple of hotels, for example, and there are tourists who are coming and going. There are workers who support infrastructure. There is electricity there, there is water, right? So workers can only stay for 2 weeks in the zone, right? So they're all coming and going. So there is a lot of workers going through those checkpoints, and the checkpoints are guarded by the military. Right, so from the outside, it's a kind of very strange sense of that being at the same time a military, but also entertainment zone, even though everyone is telling you that everything is very scary and serious here. And it is, because many people take it as an entertainment. So many tourist firms now who kind of really sell all this entertainment, but at the same time to wear long sleeves, not touching things, and etc., is incredibly important things. But some tourist firms really don't teach people whom they bring with them. So it's like there are so many crazy, unethical behavior by even those who bring people in. Okay, but I'm going a little bit in a different direction. So I'm talking to people who remember how the border was established, and in a certain way. So some people would tell you this tale about a kind of a round circle that was just drawn around the zone of the explosion, because that's how the Soviet military books taught, right? So there is a 10-kilometer zone and a 30-kilometer zone, and that's how they're designated, by circles. But at the same time, in reality, of course, they are nothing like circles. And then people also telling me that sometimes that border would come just through their garden, for example. And then they just need to give bribes and ask, for example, like the head of their village or someone, to make sure that the border would not go through their garden, and so on. So basically, every meter of this border has a kind of interesting history. And sometimes at certain places, it's completely inexistent, actually. Like, you can go in and out. At some places, it's very porous, and other places it's protected by military, right? So at some places it's very even, and other places there were some stories. And that's what I'm trying to figure out when I'm asking all these questions. I'm trying to figure out what is that history and story of establishing this border. I also spoke to politicians who actually wrote the lore about the Chernobyl zone and who presented the scientific evidence of how the border should be established. And then I spoke to the scientists who manage the zone today. And if you compare all these different layers and levels of stories, they all speak about some kind of different borders. So the contamination does not coincide with what, like the contaminated territory does not coincide with what is an official border of the Chernobyl zone. And then suddenly you're witnessing this kind of bizarre performance and coexistence of different understanding, narratives, policies, and place of power.
Mm.
So with this very kind of hard framing, and that's why I speak about territory and territoriality. Territory is that something very strict, concise, sovereignty, relation, law, right, etc., maintenance. But territoriality is that concept that allows to think about all sort of different forces from various forms of life that continuously, cross the border and carry the radiation, basically, or certain traces out of the zone and back and etc. But also different ways of coexistence of these performances, policies, politics, etc. Right? So all of it, all this natural and social aspect of territoriality is very interesting to me, and that's how territory and territoriality constantly working with each other. That's one thing. But overall, I'm quite interested in the concept of the border here because also of its symbolic, as you see already probably from what I've just said, there is this border is basically inexistent at some places, right? So therefore, it has sometimes more symbolic function rather than some kind of other function. And this symbolic function is what I relate in general to, like what this time when we are in now, thinking about ecological crisis, thinking about what's happening with us and etc. And it seems to me that these places like the Chernobyl zone actually also can teach us something about the moment where we are in, and specifically how we border them out. It seems to me that this border is precisely the expression of our inability to make a relation, to create a relation to those places. So as I study all this diversity and all these performances and process, for me, they all have to do with how we establish or cannot establish the relation to the territories of our future, perhaps, if we are being pessimistic.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that response. And I mean, contamination, of course, is something that's very present for everyone right now. So I can see how your work would be, exciting for folks who haven't really thought about what you're describing. I do have a question from Josh Hess.
Mm-hmm.
Hi there. First of all, I really appreciate your lecture. It was really interesting. And I apologize. I don't come. I come from an archaeology geography background, so it's totally not. It's totally outside of my wheelhouse. But you were mentioning that it's sort of there's a sort of pull and there's sort of a unification between these three countries that are trying to almost separate from themselves, these post-Soviet countries, but they're kind of intrinsically bound through this contaminated zone. But something that I was kind of thinking about was how, I don't know what the state is now, but people have chosen to still live in the zone in some capacity. And I know that there's even people who were there before the accident, who saw the accident happen, who still choose to live there. And outside of that, there's not entertainers, but tourists who are outside of the traditional tourists brought on by a tour, but they actually go through those zones, those borders that you were saying, and sneaking in to kind of get like an off the books kind of experience on it. So is there a draw to almost sort of like an Old West kind of feeling, like a lawless feeling for people? So is there a certain draw to that kind of, I guess, mindset to the Chernobyl exclusion zone?
Absolutely. And gaming, right? So people go there to a real life game, many, right? So, and the fact that there are the Chernobyl Games, there is a second installment recently released of this Chernobyl game. So of course it's a gamer experience also. It's all this fascination with disaster and so on. But of course there are also people who came and lived there, and I know many of them, visited some of them a couple of years ago. And it's interesting about those people, the populations. So this area is called Polisse. Lis, it's a forest in Ukrainian. So Polisse is basically kind of, the area where there are many forests. And those villages in this area, those are the most ancient kind of villages of Ukraine. And people who lived there, they, even their language is difficult to understand. And folklorists have been collecting with this particular dialect for a very long time. There are many works and et cetera, of that. So, and those people, they used to work on, to do agricultural work in the way how people did it more than thousands of years ago. And the remainders of kind of like their agricultural instruments and houses are still there if you go there, and especially if you go to this very far away villages, way beyond the area of the nuclear power plant. So you would see it would be just all these abandoned houses and like all instruments. And I went with some specialists and they told me, you see, like this is exactly what like 1,000 years ago, what, that's what we know from this area. They looked exactly the same. And it was interesting that, the Soviet state chose specifically this area for locating two things. One, of course, nuclear power plant, and another, the Duga radar, which you may know as a Russian woodpecker, which was that secret huge radar that was supposed to be hidden in the forests. But it was supposed to send the radio waves and make sure. So like it was very like the Cold War architectural item, right? So that was supposed to protect Soviet Union from like American attack. Right. So, and it would give like something about 20 minutes only to send a signal and to hide, for example, if missiles go or something like this. So, and this, it's a huge, it's a kind of like radar, which is like almost a technological wonder. When you are stayed near it, you feel like you are trembling. And this huge radar was really hidden in the forest at that time. There was a zone around it. And, if you don't cross a certain point, you never see it with all this hugeness, right? So it was quite hidden there. But it was funny that when it started malfunctioning and they did something wrong in terms of how those frequencies operating, and it was interfering with civilian frequencies, and therefore that sound was heard by radio listeners in the UK, in the States, and so on. And that's why it became known as a Russian woodpecker, although nobody knew what it was. But the guess was that it has something to do with something that comes from the Soviet Union. And that something was this huge radar in the very center of this ancient village in Policia. So, and it was a kind of a combination of something high tech and something completely ancient, like literally being within like 20 meters from each other. And then later in the 70s, they started also building the nuclear power plant. So it's a kind of a strange area how it was chosen specifically, right? So despite of all the treasures and what it was and et cetera, and it was a kind of like almost occupied by those military strategic architecture plants and etc. And Chernobyl nuclear power plant, of course, also produced weapons grade plutonium, and despite all this peaceful Azam mythology, although it did provide electricity to Kiev, but it wasn't quite little in comparison to what it did for military purposes. Yeah, so so for this reason, this is quite an interesting area to think, and those people who were removed, so this is my long story, so those people who were removed from that area, for these particular people who would never imagine themselves living in any other circumstances because of particular traditions that they had. So for instance, one of them is that you can never find anywhere in Ukraine that they had some specific relation with the graves, with the tombs. So they needed, so if they moved somewhere, they needed to carry the tombs with them. And this is only in police, and never in Ukraine we have anything like that. And suddenly they were forcefully removed somewhere else. So many people just died from literally like stress, or maybe even the exposure to radiation, because many of them were exposed immediately, etc. But that's why as soon as they could, they actually, many of them moved back, because for them it was just not possible to live anywhere else. So they would rather live there. And there are just a few of them living there. There is an official statistics about this, and I think last time I checked was beginning of December, but I totally forgot the number. I think it's 17, or maybe a little more. But there are people who maintain this, who know how many people live, where they live. They deliver food to these people because obviously there is no infrastructure. They cannot buy bread or anything. So the population, if we speak about, again, I think your question is about the diversity of those citizens, right? Temporary or permanent or constant. So I think like when we speak about the population of the zone, I think it's worth including all of this, right? All of them, right? So some of them, those basically permanent residents, and others that come and go for various reasons.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Oh my God. I know that it's in the middle of the night for you, but Nadine, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Nadine speaking. I found your talk very like evocative and provocative. And I have two questions. I guess my first question, I am curious around if you could share a little more what your ethnography is materializing in the sense of the biological citizenship and territoriality that's manifesting. I'm just curious what kind of experiences of belonging that you're finding. And then second, for some reason, I found what you're theorizing. I was thinking about the Canadian context, and there have been many poisonous events, but I was thinking especially in terms of an indigenizing territoriality, especially around the concept of biological citizenship as it materializes within indigenous bodies from the genocidal state imposition through the Indian residential schools, which I think the state hoped was going to disappear, but the traces continue. Thinking too of the finding of the unmarked graves. And so so the second question was to comment perhaps on that example that I realize is not very developed within as I'm presenting it, but nonetheless arose when you were talking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things, of course, when I'm talking to people who live right near the zone, and by the way, what I also didn't mention is that there is a border. Nobody lives inside the zone except for temporary workers who live for 2 weeks. All other people and those who come to the zone live outside of it. And I also discovered the existence of something that we could call a buffer zone. That is precisely that zone where the border kind of demonstrates some sort of almost flexibility, or where some regulations kind of expose this zone, buffer zone, as a literally gray area, right? So, for example, in terms of whether you can buy certain property or cannot, right? So how much it costs. Of course, the property in Chernobyl is almost like nothing, costs nothing. But if it's like 10 meters there, it suddenly costs a lot. So like there is a lot of very weird, kind of completely wild political economy is going on there, and it's very interesting to explore. Yeah, but speaking about what this, again, when I speak to people who live in all this buffer zone gray area, so they, of course, speak a lot about various illnesses and traumas, etc. And what I see also, how differently people speak about this, right? So, for example, some men I see wouldn't easily speak about that exposure because of this myth, basically, that somehow it makes them less manly if they're exposed to radiation. So therefore, some of them never claimed any health care just because they just were afraid that, you know, their kind of friends or villagers would think wrong about them or something like this. So it's a kind of very interesting how it's all mixed. But so the learning and systematizing all these narratives and cases, there is, of course, a lot of work is done about this, right? So there are many medical anthropologists, there is some state statistics, etc. It doesn't mean that I need to actually discover all of this. So I have a lot of data that has been already published. But then I also have my own questions that in a certain way would allow me to discover something about that data, right? And see this data through the frames of certain narratives, repression or myths or other things. So this is one thing. Kind of doing this study. But what really attracts me specifically in relation to the questions and topics that you mentioned about indigenous trauma and other things, I'm quite interested in what is happening recently with epigenetics in this respect, right? So in a certain way, when we've learned at some point that trauma has a material expression in the body and is also heritable. That's where it becomes a huge question that we speak not just about memory, we speak about, again, transformation of the bodies on the DNA level. So, right, and epigenetics, if, I don't know if you know about this area of science, which studies the expression of genes, right? So that studies certain changes, certain impacts on the body. And there are so many different changes and so many impacts on the body, from famine to radiation, violence, and whatnot, that change the body of particular subject. But we didn't know that it can change it to the extent that the genes expressed in a particular way, so the trauma may become literally heritable. And it was discovered, so epigenetic is a kind of very interesting science and realm, and has a complex history, because in a certain weird way, it was also engaged, oh my God, what's the word? All right, so just a second. So it had a bad history at some point, and it was almost silenced for some years until after the Second World War in Scandinavia. Some scientists discovered how the famine, Holocaust, they identified certain heritable changes in certain generations, particularly related to famine, Holocaust. And I think even Audrey Hepburn family was related and was one of those to whom it happened, right? So it was around that context. And after this, epigenetics gained so much attention, and it was realized as an interesting new lens to think about violence that actually goes so deep in the body. And when I think about what those inscriptions of the state, I also think about potential epigenetic traces, right? because also the evidence shares, there are some publications already today that speak about epigenetic research on radiation, and that certain changes on the body caused by radiation can also transmit to different generations. So that's where it becomes quite interesting to think. It's kind of like a new dimension of reading the materiality of trauma.
Wow.
Thank you.
It sort of reminds me in this weird way of Marion Hirsch's work, where she talks about post-memory, where it's like she takes on the embodiment of the trauma experienced by her mother during the Holocaust. And it sort of materializes in the way that she walks and like the body pains that she has and so forth. And it's something that she relieves through a kind of engagement with her mother through photographs. And so photographs have this sort of therapeutic potential for her. Of course, you're talking about something much more material, I guess, in terms of like the cellular makeup of individuals. So yeah, just shall we stop? I have so many things to think about now. So this has just been so wonderful. And I sincerely appreciate your effort to come here, despite the fact that it's literally in the middle of the night.
It's almost 4 a.m. in Ukraine.
Oh my dear. So that's really above and beyond. So thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for being here. It's been really fun.
I also thank everyone and for your amazing questions, etc. Yeah, it's so important to articulate these things for wonderful listeners. I myself think about new possible directions now. Thank you.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Well, good night, everyone. And have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Okay, bye.